afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Parental rights, the cornerstone of American law. For Andrea Picciotti-Bayer, who joins us today, raising daughters in today's culture has reinforced a lesson that no policy document will capture. Girls flourish when they are known, loved, and accompanied by the people closest to them, in this case especially the presence of an attentive and loving parent. Andrea is a legal analyst for EWTN News and director of the Conscience Project. Follow her work at conscience-project.org. Andrea, thank you very much for joining us again. How are you?
I'm doing great, Marcus. How are you?
I'm well. I'm still reflecting on my time in Taiwan, and maybe you and I ought to connect about that sometime in the future. But I'm really glad for this piece that you've penned in the National Catholic Register about parental rights. And I know I'm going to start with an extremely broad concept here, but I'd like to invite you to speak to how central the concept of parental rights are to the American way of life.
Where to begin? Where to begin, right? I mean, we know as Catholics, and the Church has taught that parents are the primary educators of our children. And so if we think about education as building up a good and effective citizenry, well, it really falls primarily on parents to be able to do that. So that's a really important contribution that we make to the common good and to our neighbors and to our country as a whole. We also realize that this is a delicate time that we're living in. There are all sorts of ideologies that are challenging the very nature of what it means to be human, male, female, the nature of the dignity of life. And so the role of parents in both modeling love and creating a community of support and encouragement are some of the greatest antidotes to the culture of death and the gender confusion that we see many of our young people struggling with.
Now, let's talk about the fact that the more the state overreaches in the life of a child, the more confused the child becomes in terms of their own humanity.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know if that's just a structural problem. It probably is, in that God, didn't just have babies, come out of thin air, but gave them to a family. And we understand the importance of the home as a domestic church. But it surely does seem that in modern times, when the state has gotten control over the raising of young people, whether it's in a communist or a socialist state or even a very large administrative state, oftentimes we lack the nuance and the love and the perception that people have when they're the ones that have been raising a child since their birth or their adoption, and really can pay attention to when there's a need for someone to push, to hold back, or just to sit with someone. The state really just can never be a substitute for a loving parent.
Every single time we have seen the state attempt to take over the role of a parent, we've seen a continued denigration in not just the dignity of the human person, but frankly, the way society considers the value of human life. Can you also speak to that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the two kind of concepts that come to mind are the attempts to eliminate the parent's role when a minor, especially, is expecting a child, and to exclude parents and instead force abortion on a young pregnant woman. We've seen so many people struggling with post-abortion regret, and just the child itself not being brought forth to life. But we're also looking at gender ideology, which is almost trying to replace the family with an ideology, oftentimes under the guise of a quote-unquote glitter family. For a child that's struggling with her own development and her own identity, having a bunch of strangers, often online and with the state's support, giving encouragement to something that isn't going to solve the mental health or the wounds that someone has, but instead create more. And we've heard time and time again with these young detransitioners, young women especially, who were pursuing gender transition and now are kind of taking that U-turn back to their biological reality And oftentimes it was coming home again that brought them profound peace, not that kind of severing that the state oftentimes was sanctioning or enforcing.
You and I have spoken about Miravelli versus Bonta, Mahmood versus Taylor. So we're seeing that this present Supreme Court is starting to regain a proper interpretation of the Constitution and the intent of our founders, and the central place of parents as bedrocks for the formation of children in society.
No, absolutely. I mean, I can't say more than I can about how great the Supreme Court is. I also, want to give a shout out to the people in the Trump administration, especially the Department of Health and Human Services, for walking back a lot of policies that were pushed forward in the Biden administration and at the Department of Education as well, to kind of force gender ideology into our school systems, into our healthcare systems, into our homes. And the Supreme Court is really looking at the constitutional protections of the right to free speech and the right to religious exercise, the free exercise of religion, and Catholic and other Christian and other faith-oriented families have been the ones to bring those cases to the court. The court can't act on their own accord. It's only when a case or controversy is before it. And there have been some pretty brave parents that aren't willing to see their children be turned around in such a dark way, and instead are pointing to their faith and pointing to the love that they have for their children to kind of walk with them through confusion and their right and entitlement to be part of the conversation.
In that light, can I also invite you to speak to the fact that we've had in recent decades presidencies and administrations that have facilitated tremendous overreach of the state on the role of parents in their fundamental right to parent their children?
Absolutely. It's, unfortunately, abuse does happen. Mm-hmm. Child abuse does happen. And but that cannot be a cover or an excuse for the kind of overreach that we were seeing with regard to parental rights, especially when it comes to abortion and gender ideology. Our presumption, our assumption should be that the home is a loving and safe home. Obviously, if there's any indication of abuse, we need to be protecting the child and helping the family to reestablish those important bonds if possible, or to get a safe and secure home for a child. But that can't be our starting place. And that's where some of these policies really were beginning. The idea that parents were somehow a threat, and they were selling that idea to confused kids, that they were really not to trust their parents and instead trust the state policies to keep things, sensitive issues, secret from their parents, instead of really sharing with the people who really know them best that they're having difficulties. And we know time and time again as parents that the more information we have, the better we can help. And that really should be what the government is supporting, is enabling parents to be the help that kids need, especially in times of distress and worry.
In light of all of this, then, as we move forward, all of our listeners, I want to invite you to speak to them, not just as a legal analyst, but also as a parent, to take seriously this God-given right, and also this right that the state cannot encroach upon, for involvement in their child's formation.
No, absolutely. I've said it before. An exercise is a right, is just like a muscle. If you don't exercise it, it's going to atrophy. And so we need to be attentive to our children's needs, partnering with institutions, whether they be schools or doctors. And if those schools or doctors aren't willing to partner with us and are keeping information, then we need to leave and find a better support system. And we're seeing more and more that happen. So I think that the future is bright, but we have to be on our guard.
I'm really glad to hear you say that. In fact, I think that quote ought to go on a T-shirt. A right is like a muscle. Don't exercise and it's going to atrophy. Thank you so much, Andrea, for your time.
Thanks, Marcus. Have a lovely afternoon.
You too. My guest has been Andrea Picciotti-Bayer. We've been talking about not just legal, but also theological realities of parental rights over children. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.